I didn't ask to be a royal librarian. Frankly, I didn't ask to be transmigrated 500 years into the past either. One minute, I was an exhausted art student dozing off in a quiet corner of the university library, caffeine withdrawal, 3 all-nighters, a regrettable instant noodle habit, and the next, I was blinking awake on a cold stone floor, wearing someone else's scratchy robes, with a hangover that felt suspiciously like history hitting me in the face. The name they gave me was insignificant, something like Jung Dae, which I butchered within the first week. Everyone forgot about me immediately because I was quiet, kept my head down, and spent my days reshelving scrolls that hadn't been touched since the last dynasty. Perfect gig, honestly. No student loans, no group projects, and the Royal Library had better light than my old studio apartment. I told exactly 0 people I was from the future. For one thing, who would believe me? For another, I come from a land where paper is cheap, and we draw cartoons of cats yelling at each other is not a great way to avoid being executed for sorcery. So I hid. I shelved. I drew tiny things in the margins of scrap parchment when no one was looking. And I stayed far, far away from the king. His Majesty Seong of Goryeo. Young, overworked, allegedly brilliant, and allegedly terrifying. Court officials whispered that he hadn't slept properly in months, that he dismissed meals as inefficient, and that he once made a senior advisor cry just by raising one eyebrow. I'd seen him exactly twice from behind a pillar, all sharp cheekbones and dark circles, moving like a man who was 2 bad days away from dropping dead. Then he dropped dead. Well, not dead, collapsed, which I only knew because he did it approximately 3 feet away from my favorite reading nook, right between the agricultural treatises and a truly boring genealogy of someone's 5th cousin. I stared at him for a solid 10 seconds, brush still in my hand. The king of Goryeo lay face down on the library floor, crown slightly askew, breathing shallow. No guards, no servants. The man had apparently snuck into his own library to escape his advisors, which was both tragic and deeply relatable. Your Majesty? I poked him with my foot. No response. Right. Okay. I'd watched enough historical dramas to know that if the king died on my shift, I'd be blamed, possibly beheaded, and I'd only just gotten used to the lack of indoor plumbing. I dragged him to a cot in the corner. He was all bones, lighter than he should have been, and propped his head on a cushion made of folded silk maps, left water within reach, and then, because I was an idiot and also an artist, I grabbed a fresh piece of parchment and wrote, "Your Majesty, please sleep. The kingdom will not burn down in 4 hours." I checked. Below that, I drew a tiny cartoon king with spiky hair and a crown trying to lift a mountain labeled work, while a tiny stick figure son looked on in despair. Then I added a second panel. The same tiny king asleep under a blanket, surrounded by smiling clouds. I left the note on his chest and fled to the poetry section until my heartbeat slowed down. That should have been the end of it. It was not the end of it. 3 days later, I noticed the scroll I'd left in the royal study, the one with the "Please Sleep" cartoon, was gone. Replaced by a fresh piece of parchment with only 2 words in elegant, furious calligraphy. Who drew this? Not who dared, not arrest the traitor. Just a question. I should have been terrified. Instead, I did something incredibly stupid. I drew another one. A cartoon king falling asleep face first into a bowl of rice. Rice grains stuck to his nose. A tiny speech bubble. Productivity. I left it under a stack of tax records and went back to cataloging. This became a routine. Every 2 or 3 days, I'd sneak a new illustration into the king's study. A cartoon king trying to fight the sun because sleep is for the weak. The sun was winning. A cartoon king being chased by a scroll labeled Memorandum. A cartoon king tucked into bed by a tiny stick figure librarian who looked suspiciously like me. The king's responses, when they came, were always the same, written across the bottom of the parchment in that sharp, controlled hand. Who are you? Why do you draw me like this? The rice incident never happened. He never ordered anyone to hunt me down, he never punished the staff, he just kept leaving the drawings out, like he was waiting for the next one. I started to like him, against my better judgment. The hunt came on a Thursday. I was reshelving a scroll on medicinal herbs when 4 guards materialized around me, grabbed me by the arms, and dragged me into the throne room. The court was there, senior advisors in silk robes, their faces arranged in various stages of outrage. And at the center, on the dragon throne, sat King Seong. He looked better than the first time I'd seen him. Still tired, still sharp, but there was color in his cheeks, and his eyes weren't quite as hollow. He held up one of my drawings, the one of the tiny king being tucked in by the stick figure librarian. "You," he said. I forgot to bow. Because in the 21st century, you don't bow to people unless they've just given you a birthday present, and even then it's awkward. The silence that followed was so thick, you could have used it to patch a roof. One of the advisors hissed, "Kneel, you fool!" I dropped into the least graceful bow of my life, nearly face-planting into the stone floor. "Your Majesty, I apologize. I forgot." "You forgot to bow to the king?" Seong said flatly. "I forget a lot of things," I said into the ground. "It's a condition." More silence. I heard someone whisper execution and started mentally rehearsing my apology speech. Instead, Seong said, "Leave us." The court erupted. Advisors protested, guards exchanged glances. A man with an impressive beard actually started crying. But the king raised one hand, that famous eyebrow. I saw it in person now. And they all scattered like startled pigeons. When the doors closed, he walked down from the throne, scroll in hand, and stopped in front of me. "Stand up," he said, "and explain why you keep drawing me as a fool." I stood. My knees were shaking, but my mouth, traitor that it is, decided to work anyway. "You're not a fool. You're a king who doesn't sleep. Sleep deprivation makes everyone look foolish. I was trying to be helpful." Helpful. "The kingdom will not burn down in 4 hours," I said. "That part was true. I checked the weather. No invasions, no fires. You could have slept for 8. He stared at me for a long time, long enough that I started counting the cracks in the floor tiles. Then, very quietly, he said, "Draw another one." "I'm sorry?" "Draw another one. Here, now." He gestured to a low table in the corner of the throne room, cleared of official documents, I noticed, and set with brushes, ink, and paper. Like he'd planned this, like he'd been waiting. I sat down, he sat across from me, and I drew a tiny king sitting in a throne made of pillows, while a tiny librarian handed him a cup of tea labeled, "Go to bed, you disaster." Sung laughed. It was the first time I'd heard him laugh, and it sounded rusty, like a door that hadn't been opened in years. But it was real. That was the beginning. We met in the library after that, night after night. He'd sneak away from his endless duties, and I'd be waiting with tea. Bad tea, because I didn't know how to brew properly, but he drank it anyway. I taught him to sketch. His first attempts were terrible. Stiff lines, overwrought shading, a horse that looked like a depressed potato. But he kept at it, because I think no one had ever taught him anything without wanting something in return. I showed him how to draw loose, how to let the brush breathe. He showed me the secret passages in the palace, and once, memorably, how to escape a particularly aggressive peacock in the royal garden. somewhere between the ink stains and the stolen midnight rice cakes, I fell in love with him. Not because he was the king, because he was the man who stayed up late just to watch me shade a cloud. Who laughed when I got ink on my nose. Who, one night, drew a tiny cartoon librarian falling asleep on a stack of scrolls and left it in my cot with the words, "Sleep, you hypocrite," written underneath. It was quiet. It was slow. It was everything I hadn't known I needed. The court, of course, ruined it. They noticed. Of course they noticed. A king who stopped attending late-night council meetings. A king who smiled. A king who spent suspicious amounts of time in the library with a low-ranking servant who bowed wrong and dressed strangely and sometimes muttered words no one understood. The accusations started small. The librarian is too familiar with His Majesty. Then larger. He doesn't behave like a proper subject. He's not from here. Then lethal. He's a spy. A foreign agent sent to weaken the throne through caricature. I was arrested on a Tuesday, dragged to the prison cells beneath the palace. The charge was treason. King Seong arrived within the hour. No advisors, no guards, just him, the ring of keys, and an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not confusion, something colder. "Tell me the truth," he said through the bars. "Are you a spy?" I should have lied. I should have made something up. But I was tired, and my shoulder hurt from where they'd grabbed me, and I'd spent 500 years in the wrong century pretending to be someone I wasn't. I'm from the future. I fell asleep in a library and woke up here. I don't know how or why. I'm an art student. Or I was. I didn't mean to spy on anyone. I just wanted a quiet place to draw. Seong looked at me for a long, long moment. Then he laughed, that rusty, real laugh, and shook his head. "You draw cats yelling at each other," he said. "You fall asleep in the poetry section. You brew the worst tea in the kingdom. And you think you're a spy?" "I'm not a very good spy." "No," he agreed. "You're not." He unlocked the cell. He took me back to the library, and the next morning, in front of the entire court, he announced the exile of 3 senior advisors, the ones who'd pushed hardest for my execution, on charges of corruption and conspiracy to destabilize the throne. "The royal librarian," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "is under my protection. Anyone who questions his loyalty questions mine." No one questioned. I wasn't made a consort. I wasn't given a title or lands or any of the things the court whispered I must have been scheming for. I stayed exactly where I'd always been, in the royal library, reshelving scrolls, drawing tiny cartoons in the margins, and making terrible tea. Except now, most nights, the king joined me. He still worked too hard. He still forgot to eat. But when the shadows under his eyes grew too dark, I'd slide a fresh drawing across the table. A tiny king wrapped in a blanket. A tiny librarian standing guard with a broom. The words, "The kingdom will still be here in the morning," written in shaky brushstrokes. And he'd look at it, and he'd sigh, and he'd lay his head down on the stack of scrolls, right there in the lamplight, and sleep. Sometimes I drew him like that. Peaceful, unguarded. No crown, no weight. Just a tired young man with ink-stained fingers and the slow, steady breath of someone who finally felt safe. The last drawing I ever made him was on a scrap of parchment left under his favorite teacup. A tiny king and a tiny librarian sitting side by side on a stack of scrolls, watching the sun rise. Neither of them is working. Neither of them is running. Neither of them is alone. Sleep well, Your Majesty. I'll be here when you wake up. He kept it folded in his sleeve for the rest of his reign, and I kept my quiet corner of the library, 500 years from home, drawing the man I loved into a world that had never expected him to rest. Some transmigrations, I've learned, aren't about grand destinies or overthrowing dynasties. Sometimes they're just about being the person who hands someone a cup of bad tea and says, "Go to bed, you disaster."